WFYI podcasts are brought to you by TechPoint, presenting the 25th Annual Best of Tech Mira Awards, recognizing digital innovation across Indiana, April 26th at Old National Center. More, including how to nominate, at miraawards.com.
This is WFYI News Now. It's January 8th, and I'm Darian Benson. On today's show, a quick preview of the legislative session that just kicked off. The city invests to reduce gun violence. And new interactive maps from WFYI examine voter turnout in November's general election. What can they tell us about Indianapolis voters today or in this year's elections?
We saw good numbers in 2020. We saw good numbers in 2016. Would we expect to see those kind of things in the future?
Those stories coming up. But first, the former Center Grove School superintendent is under a state investigation. As Eric Weddle reports, the education leader retired suddenly on Friday.
The Center Grove Schools Board announced they are working with Indiana State Police to investigate financial inconsistencies by former Superintendent Rich Arkanoff. Arkanoff retired Friday after 12 years with the district. The board says the investigation is related to Arkanoff's tracking of reimbursements and time off from work. The State Board of Accounts is also looking into the issue. Arkanoff is well known in Indiana education. Last year, he was selected as president of the Indiana Association of Public School Superintendents. Arkanoff could not be reached for comment. Center Grove Schools in Johnson County enrolls around 9,600 students. I'm Eric Weddle.
Indiana's 2024 legislative session begins today, kicking off 10 weeks of work that will end no later than mid-March. Brandon Smith reports on what to expect from the non-budget session.
Republican legislative leaders have said they don't want 2024 to be about big changes. Instead, they point to last year's work on issues including public health, mental health, housing, and education, and stress that this year should be about small changes to existing initiatives. And they absolutely don't want to spend any money this year. Now, that's typical for a short session, but fiscal leaders doubled down on their insistence that Indiana not reopen its current two-year state budget after a forecasting error by the state Medicaid program revealed last month that it will need $1 billion more in the current budget cycle than previously expected. While full agendas will be released in the coming days, we already know that student reading proficiency, chronic absenteeism in schools, and increasing childcare access will be top priorities in 2024. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
The city says it will continue to invest in its initiatives to reduce gun violence. Jill Sheridan reports city leaders say the collaborative community-based tactics have been successful.
The number of criminal homicides in Indianapolis dropped nearly 19% in 2023. City leaders attribute the drop to a three-year, $150 million violence reduction plan launched in 2021. Indianapolis Mayor Joe Hogsett says success is rooted in partnership.
A safer Indianapolis is the work of our entire city. Between community and law enforcement, we can and we will continue to attack this problem through prevention and intervention.
The city's violence reduction plan includes added law enforcement, technology, programs to address root causes of violence, and mental health help. Originally, the dollars came from federal relief funding, but leaders say it's now worked into the budget. The city said this year it will work to understand why there was an increase in youth-involved violence. I'm Jill Sheridan.
And for our final story today, November was the first municipal election after redistricting. So WFYI data reporter Zak Cassel made two interactive maps that show turnout for the mayoral race and overall voter turnout. What did we learn, and can this data help us understand the upcoming 2024 election? Jill Sheridan sat down with University of Indianapolis Assistant Professor of Political Science Laura Merrifield Wilson to look at the maps and find out. Wilson said she likes that the maps break down the data by precinct.
Both in terms like you look at the margin of victory for the mayoral race, which was a fascinating race this year, historic in a number of ways. We saw a marginal increase, and I'm a glass half full kind of gal, so I thought it was important to see where the voter turnout was really high and where it was less significant, I think, too. It was really great to see.
So these maps did come after recent redistricting in Marion County. What do you think, the impact of that redistricting had on election night?
I think that whenever we look at redistricting, the goal is to be able to create a concise population that is represented by one person that's generally representative of the area. The idea of compactness. We maybe don't talk about that in local redistricting as much as we do on a national level when we talk about congressional redistricting. But you're putting together not just a group of people who have nothing in common, but they are connected not only by their city county council representative, but by the area in which they live.
And when we look at the maps, we can see, especially on the mayoral map, the city is divided, very heavily divided, north and south, on who voted for the mayor. What do you think that tells us historically here in Indianapolis?
Yeah, well, I think this reaffirms some of the socioeconomic divisions and the idea the South Side was very working class. You're talking Decatur, Perry, Franklin Township, just about as red as you can be, especially some of those southeastern parts, rather, of Franklin Township. And the rest of the city almost exclusively being Democratic. And I think that's been consistent historically.
It's interesting looking at the maps for the mayoral race. Again, when you sort of see these pockets pop up, is that something typically that we have seen here in Indianapolis?
Sometimes to me that says, okay, a candidate is resonating differently, right? There's something unique going on in that community or that neighborhood. The old phrase, the old adage we would use is saying like all politics is local. But those little pockets do, I think, express some of that difference where it's not going to be very clearly just, everyone around here is one party or another. I think that's where you see something different going on in that neighborhood and community. It could be a response to certain issues or to the candidate. But those, in some ways, are the most fascinating because they're the deviations from the expectation.
Looking at the voter turnout map, now we're seeing, some really interesting trends here as well. I know, generally voter turnout, it was up here a little bit. We had some more people out of the polls.
Yeah, which I think is important. We always like seeing high voter turnout because that means people are interested, they're engaged, they're informed, they're educated, they're paying attention, right? They feel invested. But realistically, it tends to be pretty low for local elections. And I think the modest increase here is worth noting. I do wonder, especially because we're coming up to a presidential election cycle, we saw good numbers in 2020. We saw good numbers in 2016. Would we expect to see those kind of things in the future? And especially given how easy the city of Indianapolis and Marion County have made it to vote with early voting centers, with the ability to vote in any area on election day.
And also looking at some of these precincts, looking in the southwest side of the town and the east side of the town with very low voter turnout. Does that tell us anything, do you think?
You don't necessarily have competition in terms of the city county council. And if you don't feel like of the two things you're going to vote for, 50% of them are already decided, it's going to depress voter turnout because they don't see the incentive and the value in taking the time to do that. We saw several races that may have been competitive in the primary, but by the time you got to the general, you had one candidate, one choice, and that's certainly going to have an impact in terms of voter engagement and turnout.
No, I know you kind of touched on it, but looking at this voter turnout map, do you think it tells us anything else for next year, which is going to be a big election year?
Yes. I think it'll be interesting to see in terms of overall turnout, right, and engagement. What I would want to see is in those pockets where we had really high voter turnout, is that representative of the district, of the constituents, the people who live there? They're just very politically engaged and involved, or was it something unique to the Hogsett-Shreve race or their city county council race? And we'll be able to look at that. Hopefully we have the same data again, and we can collapse it and say, okay, what looks different from 2023 to 2024?
Thank you so much, Laura, for coming in today.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Aubriana Heron, Drew Dodlin, Kendall Antron, who composed the music for this podcast, and me, Darian Benson. Our news director is Sarah Neal Estes. If you liked today's episode, remember to subscribe and share. And follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.
WFYI podcasts are brought to you by TechPoint, presenting the 25th Annual Best of Tech Mira Awards, recognizing digital innovation across Indiana, April 26th at Old National Center. More, including how to nominate, at miraawards.com.